Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of 70 plus organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guest today is Paul Morando, who is the Chief Curator at the National Museum of the United States Army. Paul, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And the museum is planning a great new exhibit that's opening next June, a call to arms, really about the Army in the Revolutionary War.
That's right. This is an exhibit we've been working on for over 2 years now. And we wanted to sort of honor the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the United States Army with an exhibit that tells the Army's story, specifically focusing on the soldier experience. So we wanted artifacts that are directly tied to soldier stories because that fits the mission of this museum, which is to look at American history, Army history through the eyes of soldiers.
So the museum, actually, it's a huge museum. And so the Revolution plays a small piece in it. Can you just tell us a bit about the museum as a whole?
Right. So it is a big museum. Obviously the mission is to tell the Army's story, and so from beginning to present day. It's a 185,000 square foot building. So yeah, part of that story obviously is the Revolutionary War and soldier experience, and we tell that through artifacts, through different things. But trying to tell the whole Army story, you have to be a little bit more general approach to it. So where this exhibit differs is we dig deeper into why did they serve, and ultimately what were they fighting for. So those are some of the themes we're trying to answer with this exhibit, because as you know, motivation for war, joining the Army, or is changed over time during the war, right?
Sure.
And so those are that's something we're trying to capture as well.
Yeah. So what kind of artifacts do you have that can tell that story about the motives for a man to serve?
Very hard to find pieces that are directly tied to that. A lot, you have to sometimes rely on, journals, personal accounts of why they joined, what they experienced over time. As you know, powder horns can also be a good way to express what soldiers were experiencing during the war. There's a lot of information you can glean off of the etches, the drawings. It's almost like a personal journal for some of these soldiers. So that's one way.
Each man would have his own powder horn?
Many would. Some, because a lot of soldiers then were issued, they had cartridge boxes, so there was a little difference. But yeah, soldiers did carry powder horns. They did use them, but they were it's very interesting in how they want them etched and described. Their name, made by, in the year of. You actually see, in Boston, for example, some just wonderful depictions of, locations, British ships. So it's obvious that the soldiers were aware of their surroundings, what they were seeing, but more importantly, they understood how they want to be part of that, in the sense of capturing it for history in some ways. So those are some of the objects that kind of tell that story.
You also have some hats and pieces of uniforms. Can you tell us a bit about some of those? Yeah,
so as you know, Rev War material can be difficult to come by. So there's only so many uniforms that are related to soldiers who served. So we're going to have on display pieces like that. We're working with the Canadian War Museum, for example. They have a fabulous Loyalist coat, which is a story, which is another, interesting story to talk about. That's another way to capture, a different experience. So we are lucky enough to bring that item on loan.
Wow.
We are in talking with the French.
Hmm.
They have too a beautiful coat that's from the time period. We're not
Okay.
sure if this particular coat served in the United
Hmm.
States during the war, but it is of the period
Hmm.
and of the style and the design that a French soldier would have worn. So we're very excited about that one as well.
Amazing. And you also have some weapons.
Yes, no shortage of
Yeah.
weapons in this exhibit. We have an entire case um, sort of dedicated to the sort of evolution of weaponry during the
Hmm.
Revolutionary War, from fowlers to muskets to rifles,
Hmm.
different sizes and shapes, and to explore what these soldiers
Hmm.
used,
Right.
um, and you know, and complementing that is one of the kiosks that delves even deeper into
Hmm.
the components of a weapon, how they
Hmm.
fired, little videos on this kiosk to show the public
Interesting.
what they used.
Okay. Would this is, someone just asked me this the other day about how men would make their cartridges. Would they make them ahead of time? Would someone else make them? I mean, what was the process of actually loading your weapon? And
I think it was a little bit of both. I think they did make their own.
mm,
I even read accounts of women making
mm,
cartridge boxes, wives and
mhm,
camp followers who,
mhm,
who 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 did that. And so, yeah, it was a combination of all that in prepping for battle
mhm.
during the war.
and and we know about, so the men would carry a cartridge box with cartridges preloaded, but at some time you might run out during the course of a battle. So,
Absolutely. I mean, it's all the during battle, anything could happen.
right.
It's
Yeah.
and you got to remember these are soldiers today. It's a different from a technology
Right.
perspective. It's
Oh yeah.
fairly rudimentary in terms of if you think about warfare
Yes.
today. So and that lends itself to we're trying to depict
Hmm.
what they went through on the battlefield, right?
Hmm.
Seeing trained men, British regulars coming at you with fixed bayonets, or
Hmm.
these are disciplined, seasoned soldiers.
Right.
For the young American Army, this had to
Mhm.
been mind blowing
Oh yeah.
the ability to just stay and fight
Right. Right.
with that, is truly remarkable.
It is.
And that too is we also try to convey the brutality of
Hmm.
18th century warfare.
It really was. How does the Army change over the course of the 8 years of the war? I mean, how do the composition of the men in it and who they are?
That's a great question, and what this exhibit partly is trying to figure out, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, early in the war, the sort of rage militaire, the patriotism that
Hmm.
envelops a lot of
Right.
men to join the army, and it's based on a lot of times it's based on success on the battlefield or
Right.
not, right?
Hmm.
So what I discovered is a lot of some soldiers who join the army and then things are not going so well. They're like, nope, I'm
Yeah.
going to leave, go back home.
Yeah.
Um, they're following the war somehow, and things are starting to
Hmm.
look better, right?
Mm.
And they kind of rejoin
Wow.
or get back in, because as you know, the war was a ebb and flow, right? It
Right.
was
Right.
a little cat and mouse game done
Yeah.
by Washington to evade the British Army in
Hmm.
certain degrees. So, motivation for war is very interesting during these times. In fact, you could probably compare it to why soldiers join the army today.
Right. Yeah.
Um, Patriotism, but
Hmm.
also a
Hmm.
sense of adventure.
Right.
It's also a job
Yeah.
that
That's
they
right.
get paid to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and family reputation was a very
Right.
big thing as well.
Hmm.
So all these things are happening, and it's
Hmm.
not just a simple answer as if, yep, they were just patriotic and wanted
Yeah.
no.
Right. Yeah.
There's also personal reasons,
Right.
and so that was really fascinating to uncover
Hmm.
while putting this exhibit together.
No, that really is one of the things that historians have been trying to figure out. I mean, what is the motivation, how they change. So asking you questions that I've been puzzling over myself. So we're talking with Paul Morando, who is the Chief Curator at the National Museum of the United States Army, which is preparing a new exhibit, Call to Arms, which will open next June, talking about the Army in the Revolutionary War. And now you said you have maybe 500,000 artifacts altogether in the museum, but you have just 285 in this exhibit. And I'm wondering how you go about selecting or deciding what pieces you'll use or what stories you want to tell.
Yeah. Yeah, in the Army's collection, there is a large collection. But in reality, as far as the Rev War is concerned, it's fairly small.
Hmm.
We needed to figure out a way to bringing other artifacts on loans from major institutions, smaller institutions, that really focus in on the soldier's story.
Hmm.
And as you may know, there is not a significant amount of material culture
Right.
from the Revolutionary War. And if there are, a lot of them are type pieces that are not connected to
Right.
an individual soldier. So that even became harder to kind of cull down.
Hmm.
But, in the last 2 years, I made a lot of visits to a lot of different institutions. And I was so amazed of these collections or these artifacts that are out there,
Hmm.
whether they're in storage, whether in, sort of small out of the way places. Once you start talking to people, historians,
Hmm.
collectors, these pieces start popping up.
Right.
And so then the challenge was, well, how do we go about in getting these pieces on loan, some of, for two
Hmm.
years,
Hmm.
to, add to this exhibit, add to this story. So part of the, I think the best part of my job was going out to these
Yeah.
places,
Hmm.
looking at the artifacts, trying to figure out how they would fit into our story,
Hmm.
was just amazing. So, like, for example, the Rhode Island Historical Society,
Hmm.
wonderful organization that has a tremendous collection when it comes to Rev War pieces. But more importantly, that they know for the most part who owned these items, who handled these items throughout the war. And talking to the curators, they want to, in some ways, get these pieces out on display,
Right.
out on exhibit,
Right.
and just not be used for research and
Hmm.
and writing. So, um, um, but it was a challenge. For me, I would like to see more artifacts on display,
Sure.
but my designers and folks were like, we need to stop. We need to
Right.
kind of, because sometimes
Hmm.
too much
Yeah. It
it
overwhelms. Yeah.
overwhelms the story.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. And part of what you're doing is trying to connect certain artifacts with particular soldiers. So it's not just a general, here are uniforms, here are weapons, but you're trying to tell the stories of individuals.
That's correct. So, we know like loyalist unit form I mentioned before.
Mm.
We know his story, so that will be told
Wow.
in there. We other weapons or smaller items, camp cups,
Yeah.
canteens.
Hmm.
We have many that are connected to soldier stories because that's important. It's neat to see different pieces, type pieces, or
Hmm.
even weapons, as I mentioned
Yeah.
before. But when you can tie that weapon to a soldier who served,
Hmm.
it just gives more meaning.
Right.
Visitors connect more with
Hmm.
that versus just seeing a regular weapon. And then another way we do this beyond artifacts is through our cast figures.
Hmm.
These are realistic
Hmm.
cast figures that, and for the first time here at the museum, we're going to be depicting real individuals who served during the
Wow.
war, right? So
Mm.
as you see, there's an image. Gives you see about 4 or 5 of the 7 that we're going to have
Mm.
on display. So what did they wear? You
Hmm.
know, how did they interact with each other?
Hmm.
But also, they are based on real individuals. So there you see in the foreground, John and Anna Lane, right? The husband and wife. Anna Lane actually served, on the battlefield, and so there's just a unique story, amazing story with that. In the background, you can see a First Rhode Island soldier,
Hmm.
Cato Varnum, um,
Hmm.
based on an individual who did serve. Compelling story there.
Hmm.
So beyond artifacts, that's another way to connect with our visitors.
We're talking with Paul Morando, who is the Chief Curator at the National Museum of the United States Army, which is preparing an exhibit, Call to Arms, about the soldier in the Revolutionary War, opening in June of 2025. And I understand you also got a Grenadier's cap from the Old Colony Historical Society here in Massachusetts.
Right, and that is connected to Toby Gilmore, an African American who served during the war.
Mm-hmm.
So that's extremely rare. There
Yeah.
are I don't know if I can you know, recall how many artifacts that are related to African American soldiers who served during the
Wow.
Revolutionary War. So to have that sort of cap plate, if you will,
Right.
is extremely important
Mm-hmm.
because it gets another story or maybe an unknown story,
Mm-hmm.
part of the larger story
Mm-hmm.
of the Revolutionary War, and begs the question of freedom and what it
Right.
meant, what did it mean to enslave, what did it mean
Right.
to those who joined the army
Mm-hmm.
to seek freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and a sort of complex and
Mm-hmm.
somewhat way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we needed a way to capture that experience. And as a curator, you need objects and
Right.
artifacts to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think is really brings people to these type of exhibits.
Right. Do you have any of Cato Varnum? You have Cato Varnum on display, or his figure. Do you have any of Cato Varnum's artifacts on display?
We do not.
Uh,
We do have a letter
mm-hmm.
to Private Thomas Nichols,
Mm-hmm.
where he's you can tell he's probably who served during the war,
Mm-hmm.
um, and probably suffered some kind of PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
and he's troubled. And so his experience after the war wasn't positive at all.
Right. Right.
Whereas Toby Gilmore, who has the
Mm-hmm.
hat that we are getting, he leads a fairly successful life after the war,
Mm-hmm.
within his community. So his experience was a lot different. I would like to say that one of the most significant artifacts that we're going to put on display is a flag connected to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment.
Oh.
So in the state of Rhode Island, they have two flags
Mm-hmm.
that are connected to the Rhode Island Regiment. The one we're going to put on display, I strongly believe, belonged to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. So that is the first African American regiment stood up by the Army,
Mm-hmm.
and that flag has never been on public display
Wow.
before in a museum setting.
Mm-hmm.
So think about that.
Yeah.
Here's a flag that flew at Yorktown,
Mm-hmm.
and represents the African American experience
Mm-hmm.
during the war. It's a complicated history, but
Mm-hmm.
it's important that this flag gets on display
Mm-hmm.
in this setting,
Mm-hmm.
within the Army Museum. So that is probably one of the top artifacts we'll have on display.
That's great. Great. And how long has the Army Museum is at Fort Belvoir, just outside of Washington, and can you tell us a bit about the museum itself? What we'll see if we go there?
Sure. Yeah. So we've tell sort of comprehensive story of the United States Army, from 1775 until present day, and we do that in a very personal way. It's it's very engaging. The artifacts, the dioramas, the exhibits are it's very upfront, close and
Mhm.
personal. So you're sort of drawn to those stories, like I mentioned. And a lot of museums, when they deal with the military, deal with the army, it's from a branch specific, or
Right.
infantry, or aviation, quartermaster. Um, while we do tell those stories, it's really from the soldier's perspective,
Right.
and what they went through over this sort of course of American history,
Mhm.
based on the campaigns that the Army's been involved in. So it's a different approach, and it's one that has connected very well with our visitors.
Right. Right. And Paul, in addition to artifacts, you also are using a lot of technology in different ways to tell these stories or to fill out the story.
Correct. One of the ways we're doing that is something I'm very excited about. Is these, um, and it is an example you see up there. So these topographical map projections, right? So you have a screen that kind of gives you an illustrated history of, let's say here, Yorktown. We're
Mhm.
also doing one on Bunker Hill, and then there is a map, on the bottom there, that's
Mhm.
also has projections on it that show troop movements, battle
Mhm.
engagements, and they kind of work together with each other. So this is a great way visually to
Mhm.
capture something like Yorktown, right? We
Right.
read about it,
Mhm.
maybe we have a general understanding of it, but
Mhm.
do we really? Do we understand how, from an operations
Right.
perspective, how that battle was fought, how it was won? It was a
Mhm.
siege, right? It was
Mhm.
over time. Same thing with Bunker Hill, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, most of fighting, it's Breeds Hill, right? No one, Bunker
Yeah.
Hill.
Yeah.
So what is the landscape of Bunker Hill?
Mhm.
I'm sure you're very familiar with it, but how, but for visitors, this is a way to immerse them a little
Right.
bit
Right.
into what the British were seeing, and then what the Americans were seeing from the
Mhm.
opposite side. Um, I'm very excited to see how this is going to be responded to by our visitors, because
Right.
I think it's one way to draw sort of more immersive way into this war.
Mhm. And it's often, if you go to Bunker Hill today, it's really hard to envision what this would have looked like. 'Cause I think it's a little easier at Yorktown, but still, big area, and you're trying to take all of this in. I mean, you can't ride around on a horse, maybe you can, or see it the way Washington or Cornwallis or Lafayette or one of the soldiers would have experienced it.
That's right. And today with technology, there's a lot you can do,
Mhm.
but we didn't want to be overwhelming
Right.
with technology.
Yep.
So I would say these two pieces are probably the more immersive of what we're going to have
Mhm.
on display. Others are more sort of simple kiosk, informational based,
Mhm.
where you could delve deeper into different artifacts.
Right.
For example, I mentioned powder horns earlier. We have a
Mhm.
kiosk that's dedicated to powder horns, so you can
Mhm.
get up close and
Right.
personal on those sketches and drawings, and delve deeper in interpreting them.
Yes.
So I think that's quite fascinating. And then we have a film on camp life that
Mhm.
depicts harsh conditions, from Valley Forge to Morristown. This is more of a, I would say, atmospheric type of film.
Mhm.
It's not narrated. It's just in the background, showing what these soldiers went through. And then the
Great.
artifacts are presented in front of it that are sort of the things they carried, or the
Mhm.
small items that they had on their person, whether it's a utensil, whether it's a camp coffee cup or a camp
Mhm.
stove, or things like that. So a large part of what soldiers did was camping, was in the field,
Right.
getting either before or after a
Mhm.
battle, and no different from what soldiers go through today in some cases. Um, so yeah, we present
Yeah.
that.
And seeing Anna Lane reminds us that there would have been women in the camps. And Deborah Sampson, of course, joined as a soldier in disguise. And of course, Molly Pitcher. I mean, there are famous stories that come out of this, but then they kind of represent this bigger story of women in the camps who are doing a lot of the laundering, nursing, other really essential things.
Yeah, and we capture the sort of camp follower story,
Yeah.
a women in the army story, which was, I think, often overlooked, but a very important aspect of the war. Sort of traveling behind the army, so to speak, and was very important in supplying, in some ways, comforting, right, in terms of, also from a medical perspective too. Was very, very important. So we tell that story to some degree through Anna Lane. However, she did, she was wounded on the battlefield. She was one of the first to get a pension for her service in the Army, which is also another aspect of this exhibit that we delve into. What happened after the war? Where did these soldiers go? As you know, the sort of veteran experience of the Revolutionary War is quite different than it is today. And in fact, it took a long time for soldiers to get their pensions, to get their service recognized, and it wasn't very easy. So we show that through pension records. We show that through correspondence. We showed and imagery and so it wasn't always a positive experience for the common Revolutionary War soldier after the war.
Well, why do you think it took so long for the soldiers to get their pensions? Partly the country was broke, but were there other things holding this back? And I read somewhere that people became annoyed when soldiers were demanding payment, thinking they wanted to become a professional legion.
Yeah, I think the biggest reason you mentioned it is financial, but there was, and even in the beginning of the war, this fear of a standing army, right? The whole idea was we're trying to fighting against that, right? And the idea of a standing army wasn't positive with everybody. And even and I don't know how true it is all across the board, but there's accounts of soldiers not really getting the respect that these days it's different, right? Thank you for your service is something that you hear all the time. You didn't really hear that back in the 18th century, because it wasn't necessarily considered a noble profession. Now, being an officer, different.
That's right.
It had family lineage. It was a different way of looking at it. But yeah, when a lot of soldiers came home from the war, it was like, okay, back to work. Don't necessarily want to hear about your experience because of all the things I just kind of discussed about. So I think partly that's why it took so long for them to get their recognition and to get their pension.
Well, I'm glad that the National Museum of the United States Army now is recognizing them and telling this story, because it's really an important one. I wonder if, there are groups like, well, the Society of the Cincinnati of the officers, but the SAR, the DA, the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, are you involved at all with them or with other similar organizations?
We are. SAR, we're actually getting some items from them as well. And the Society of Cincinnati here in Washington, D.C. has been extremely helpful. That's another collection that is just remarkable.
It is tremendous,
It is. And they don't necessarily have I would say, a standard museum to showcase those items. So they love to work with organizations to get their artifacts seen. And them being so close was a great. It's a great relationship. So yeah, we are connecting with those organizations and trying to figure that out. And also, what we've done for the end of the exhibit, because one of the hardest things to do is how do you end an exhibit.
Yeah.
Where do you go after the war,
Right.
right? Yeah. Okay, we won. Okay, what now? So we wanted to make some kind of linkage to today's Army, right? Which is not easy to do, but found out there are a lot of similar connections, right, in terms of why soldiers join the Army, why people join the Army. Not very different from why Revolutionary War soldiers joined. Sense of adventure, pay, patriotism, to kind of make that connection to the importance of service to one's country, and that common bond that soldiers make when they serve together. And remember, you got to remember that was a new phenomenon
Right.
amongst our American citizens, where I kind of feel that that service, that sort of um, you know bonding in combat, really, I would say, help forge sort of our national identity. You got to
Yes.
remember, the Army was born before the country was born,
Right. Yeah.
and so we are figuring out also how to run an army,
Right.
um, you know, and the components of an army, the structure of an army. George Washington struggled with that throughout the war in getting enough troops, enough supplies, command and control,
Yeah.
having quality officers to
Mhm.
run those different units. Those are just fascinating to me.
They are. They are. Yeah.
That how he was able to do that
Yes.
while
Yeah.
fighting a war.
Yeah. Now, are you able to tell any of that really complicated story of structure and Washington's attempts to command?
We do. So, and certainly George Washington will have his role here in this exhibit.
Hmm.
In certain ways, we will have artifacts that are
Hmm.
connected to him that he had, and there's ways that we're going to kind of look at discipline,
Hmm.
also structure of the army. The sort of the first establishment, the second establishment of
Hmm.
different armies, the enlistment. How
Right.
one of the biggest problems was, okay, yeah, it's great, patriotism is awesome, I'm going to sign up and fight, but I like to get paid well.
Yeah.
Or what else can So there becomes this combination of patriotism and reward to some
Hmm.
degree. So then you had longer enlistments, like 3-year enlistments. You had promise of more money in land and things like
Hmm.
that, because in order to sustain a successful military, you have to have incentive for these soldiers to stay and fight.
Right.
Otherwise, they're just going to go back on the farm,
Hmm.
go back to their families, and that's what a lot of them did.
Yeah.
And there was some, even some aspects of mutinies throughout
Hmm.
the war, because of what I just discussed. So, yes, we tackle that.
Hmm.
It's there, because it's important to understand how fragile the army was
Right.
during that time period.
Yeah.
And I mentioned discipline. Early on at Bunker Hill, great example. Who's in charge?
Hmm.
Initially, it was this sort of like interwar between the colonies of
Yeah.
and there was lack of discipline.
Hmm.
And then by Yorktown, you can see the sort of 360-degree change in terms of how a military should operate, right?
Hmm.
Clear communication with the French, clear
Hmm.
communication amongst the generals in the American
Hmm.
Army led to success at Yorktown. So it's there, right? So when you
Hmm.
go from Bunker Hill for that
Hmm.
map, interactive map I showed you, and
Yeah.
then to Yorktown, I think those are two pivot points, or occasions where you go from, sort of a ragtag army
Right.
to a professional force.
Right. We're talking with Paul Morando, the Chief Curator at the National Museum of the United States Army. Now, the United States Army runs the museum, but it opened it with it's a public facing, it's Now, how do you need to show an ID to get in? Is it on a secure facility? How do we visit, and how much does it cost?
It's free. Our mission is to educate the public on the history of the United States Army. So we're not on sort of proper Army
Right.
facility where you have to check in with ID. It's easy and open access to the public. The main mission of this museum is that to be sort of the public face of Army's history. So we strive in trying to make it as accessible as possible to access the Army's history in different ways. So, this exhibit is just sort of another example to try to highlight the Army's role in our history. Because it's extremely important story. It's not an Army story. This is an American story, and to some degree a world story, especially as we're talking about the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of this nation. I often say, and it's fairly obvious, but maybe not so much, is on July 4th, 1776, we declared our independence. We still had to win the war to secure it, right? And without those soldiers, without the United States Army, we couldn't have done it.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your service as a reservist, but also as the curator of this tremendous museum, and for sharing. Anything else we should add before we let you go?
Well, I just, those who listen to this podcast or view it, just spread the word about this exhibit to your families, friends, communities out there. We want people to come and see this exhibit, to experience it, because I think it's going to be a landmark exhibit.
I'm looking forward to it, so thank you. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer. I don't know if Jonathan's related to John and Anna Lane, whom we saw earlier, and to our listeners throughout the country, actually throughout the world, and every week we thank some of you for joining us. And if you're in one of these places, send Jonathan Lane an email, jlane@revolution250.org, and he'll send you some of our Revolution 250 memorabilia. So this week, friends in Hamilton, New Jersey, Overland Park, Kansas, Walpole, Massachusetts, Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and all places between and beyond. Thanks for joining us. And now we will be marched out on the road to Boston.